Welcome to the Spirit of Truth, and thank you so much for y'all coming here. I wanted to talk today about the Civil War, the bloodiest thing ever happened on our half of the planet. It was the second bloodiest thing, basically, in human history up until that time. And I really want to focus on two people, and that would be Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee. And I certainly think Lee is controversial in today's age, but I would like to look at them through the lens, of course, of the fact, let me just give this big point, the Civil War ends at Easter. Ended at Easter, and back then everybody understood that this was like a rebirth for America. Okay, first, Robert E. Lee is a very interesting man who was, he was big time, second in his class at West Point with no demerits. And he was the person that Abraham Lincoln wanted to have lead the Union Army once this little bitty rebellion was over. This was considered, in fact, Lincoln is going to call for volunteers for 90 days, thinking this war will be over very quickly. But Robert E. Lee is the person who was seen as should be the leader of this Union Army. Well, Robert E. Lee, after getting that offer, is going to go to Arlington, which of course today we know is a cemetery. And by the way, that happened because of the Civil War. Just to play a trick on him, they decided to bury bodies up near his house, which actually comes through his wife, who is a descendant of George Washington. But Robert E. Lee, that night that he is offered command of this Union Army that is going to march to Richmond to basically just destroy the Confederacy and end the Civil War, she heard him that night in his room agonizing, which, by the way, he didn't do that very often. He was a very controlled person. She also heard him praying about what he should do. And of course, what he decides, even though he did not like slavery, he did have slaves through his wife, which he will have released during the war. He didn't like secession. He actually voted against his home state of Virginia seceding. But he did feel that God was telling him that he should go with his home state of Virginia, which, by the way, Virginia had been around since 1607. This American thing had been around since 1776. And so he resigned from the U.S. military and then becomes actually a fairly slow rising guy in the Confederate Army. He doesn't do a lot for the first year, but all of a sudden, when Robert E. Lee takes command, the Union Army is about 3 miles from Richmond, takes command because Joe Johnston is wounded, and so Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, will appoint him as the general of what Lee's going to rename the Army of Northern Virginia. Very quickly, in 1 month, Lee had moved the battles from the gates of Richmond to the gates of Washington, D.C. And all of a sudden, European nations were starting to wonder, should we recognize the Confederacy? Well, very quickly, on the bloodiest day in American history, the Battle of Antietam. I just think it's a fascinating battle. It's in Maryland. And this is kind of a tie, most people will say. It's a very interesting story if you ever get to read about this. Lee's orders to his generals, one of them was lost. And so the Union Army, led by George McClellan, understood now what Lee was trying to do. Lee decides to fight and holds his own, never runs from the field. But he does leave, and it looks kind of like maybe the first Union victory against Lee. And we'll get to this here in just a bit. But Abraham Lincoln is going to use this to launch the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, from this, let me just very quickly, the war is going to extend, as you all know, until 1865. This was way longer than anybody thought, and I would say that the major reason for that is because of Robert E. Lee. And you certainly could look at this and the amount of deaths and the destruction that was done during this time period. But by extending this war, I will just tell you, this became a war about emancipation. This was not what the war started about. A lot of people thought Lincoln was putting together armies to invade the South and free the slaves. Not at all. It was just to end secession and bring these states back. And then we'll talk about slavery. Well, because the war had extended, I'll talk about the Emancipation Proclamation, but this is why slaves, the freedom of slavery actually comes because of the war, and the war is what Lee had extended. A couple of last things about Lee. Just as he finally became overall commander of all Confederate armies about, I think, 2 months or so before the war was over. He had only been commander in Virginia, but Jefferson Davis, the Confederate president, is going to say, you need to be the overall commander. And one of the things Lee wants to do is actually to use slaves, free them, and to fight against the Union Army. A lot of people were shocked by this, like how in the world could they do this? But Lee was a hero. And just before, a few weeks before the war ended, there were actually African Americans marching down the streets of Richmond. And so Robert E. Lee himself, by the end of the war, was for freeing the slaves to get independence for the Confederacy. Then one last thing is at the Battle of, at Appomattox, just after Richmond was finally took the Union Army. They thought it would take about maybe 3 days, 2 weeks or whatever to take Richmond. It took 4 years. But as he was heading out of Richmond, and gets to Appomattox, and it looks like the Confederate Army has been surrounded. His artillery commander named E. Porter Alexander comes to him and says, General Lee, there's actually an open space, just a bunch of woods to the north of us. Just release all the soldiers, and you are now the big-time commander. Just order partisan warfare. Today we would call that guerrilla warfare. Just launch that instead of fighting battle by battle, army versus army. Just start to have this crazy warfare, which there were bits of this that appeared, especially in Missouri. But for the most part, that's not the way the war was fought. And Robert E. Lee looked at this and said, he started to saying, this will lead to so much destruction and so much horror. And he does say, Lee says, I would rather die 1,000 deaths. And by the way, Lee honestly, on that very day, he thought about this. He said, if I ride out there by my troops, a Union sharpshooter would see me and kill me. Lee thought about basically committing suicide because he just saw this surrender. But he said, no, my duty is to live. And he says to his E. Porter Alexander, if you want to take a bunch of bushwhackers, fine. But the honorable thing to do is surrender. And so Lee will surrender. And basically, by the way, it's very interesting, Palm Sunday, that is April 9th, 1865. And it's just an incredible story of Lee and Grant meeting. But when Lee surrendered, it launched, all of a sudden, all the other armies of the Confederacy start also to surrender. A lot of people were worried about a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. You may know him from an amazing movie with Tom Hanks. But he's also one of the founders, of the KKK. And he had, in fact, William T. Sherman said, the Union general, there'll never be peace in Tennessee until Nathan Bedford Forrest is dead. But Forrest surrenders. He actually is going to surrender. So do other Confederate commanders. And so the Civil War ends. And obviously there's a lot more after that, but the idea that Lee could have said, look, just guerrilla warfare, all kinds of partisan craziness. But no, he decides to surrender, and he tells his men as he is heading out and talking to them, make yourselves Americans again. I also just want to say this about Lee, because Lee talked about this, and I think it's very genuine, and that is that he prayed for his enemies. He took very seriously the whole idea of loving your enemies and seeing a higher realm than just this world, looking at God's will and eternity. After the war is over, Robert E. Lee is offered a castle in Europe. He's also offered from an insurance company up north saying, we just want to use your name for like life insurance. And they send him a check for, I forget, quite a bit of money. And he returns it, saying, I can't accept money for services that I do not render. And people wondered, and he certainly wondered, what is he going to do for his country? There were some former Confederates who would move to Brazil, which is basically the last place on this half of the planet to have slavery up until the 1880s. But Lee gets offered to be the head of a little college in Lexington, Virginia called Washington College. And he decided he wanted to become the leader of what is today Washington and Lee University. And he was very much about trying to make sure that these young men and the young men of this college could be prepared for this world. But he also, of course, put up a chapel, and it is still there, and that is where he is buried today. The second person that I'd like to talk about is Abraham Lincoln, who is fascinating. You know, I grew up as a Southern guy who loved studying the Civil War, and basically I just didn't really pay attention to Abraham Lincoln. But when I started to study him, I'm totally amazed by him and how he wrote. This is a guy who, by the way, this is his words, he reckoned he had about 1 year of schooling. A lot of people, of course, think he's born in Illinois or Indiana. He's actually from Kentucky, born in Kentucky, and then early in his life moved to Indiana, then Illinois. He is probably, at that point in his life, he is probably an atheist. He saw such pain in the world that he, like many people today, is like, how could there be a God? Well, he only served for one term in the House of Representatives during the Mexican War in the late 1840s. It looked like he was pretty much done with big-time politics. However, there's a case called Dred Scott. The Dred Scott case of 1857 is where the U.S. Supreme Court is going to say that slaves were property, and that therefore that's a property right. Popular sovereignty, people voting for something, sorry, you can't use that. And what the Supreme Court was here saying, as far as slavery out west, and by the way, if you could sum up the causes of the U.S. Civil War, it's those two words, Western slavery, or slavery's expansion. Lincoln was totally willing to allow slavery to exist in the South for as long as whenever. The whole point of the Republican Party is just don't expand. Part of that is it's a moral issue, but part of it too is free labor. Let people who are moving out there have their own labor and not have to compete with slave labor. That's why lots of immigrants who came to America in the early 1800s stayed north. They did not come south. But what the Dred Scott decision does by saying that, by the way, this is interesting with the U.S. Supreme Court. If it had just been a case where they said, Dred Scott, look, you're a property, you're a slave, go away. You shouldn't be here. We would never even talk about this case. The Supreme Court starts basically what it does now. It's not about that one case. They are basically sort of making legislation, saying we believe you can't draw a line like the Missouri Compromise of 1820. You can't have popular sovereignty and let the people choose out west. This is a minority right, a property right of a slaveholder. Therefore, slavery is legal everywhere in the West. And by the way, they don't say it, but can you imagine the next Supreme Court case? If holding a slave is a property right of the Fifth Amendment, the next obvious case is why can't there be slavery in the North? And by the way, in New York, there was a case on its way to the U.S. Supreme Court about slavery is a property right in the North. But a little thing called the Civil War got in the way of that. Okay, coming back into politics because of the Dred Scott case, Abraham Lincoln is going, of course, the very famous Lincoln-Douglas debate. Stephen Douglas was incredibly well known, and Abraham Lincoln was not. And so a lot of people assumed that Stephen Douglas is just going to just wallop poor little Abraham Lincoln, the guy who reckoned he had 1 year of schooling. But, and I can't go into detail, but if you ever read these, because they had people that were recording these, people writing these down. It is amazing to read these debates, and it's amazing to read what Lincoln and Douglas had to say. Lincoln, the basic thing is Lincoln said we should not allow slavery to expand into the West. Douglas said, no, it's popular sovereignty. And I won't get into the Dred Scott of how Douglas is going to try to get around the Dred Scott case, but he says there's a way to get around Dred Scott so that we can have the people decide if they want slavery here or not. It's up to the people. Well, by the way, it's interesting. First of all, Lincoln loses the election. He will not get elected, although he is seen and by many people as a hero. The other thing about the debate is that Abraham Lincoln appeared very racist. By the way, Douglas is trying to expose that, hey, Lincoln, you want blacks to vote. You're an abolitionist. You want blacks to serve on juries. And Abraham Lincoln was very no, and no. Even about blacks being citizens, he's like, no. I just do not want to see slavery spread into the West to compete with free labor. In his heart, Abraham Lincoln did see there's something wrong with slavery, but he didn't feel that he had the power, or even as he said, this desire to kill it where it already exists. Well, the election of 1860, even though, as I've said, Lincoln is going to lose that Senate debate, or I'm sorry, not maybe the debate, but he does lose the Senate seat. But in 1860, it's the Republican Party. He is nobody's first choice to be the Republican candidate, but he's most people's second choice. And so it's an incredibly complicated election of 1860. I know a lot of people, our current election in the year 2020 is seen as one of the craziest in American history. I will just say, if you study the 1860 election, I think most people say that is the craziest election. Because it's basically, there are two Southerners, and then there's Lincoln and Douglas in the North. Lincoln is not even on the ballot in most of the South. They did not want, and this is the brand new Republican Party, Southerners would have vomited on the ballot if they had seen him there. And yet, Lincoln wins. He only gets about 40% of the vote, but he does win the Electoral College because he wins big time in the North. And what happens here, of course, it starts the secession movement. And this is the lower South. 7 of the 15 states will secede simply because of the election, saying, look, they've long lost the Congress, House and Senate. The Supreme Court is being ignored, and they've lost the presidency. And so, therefore, it is just time for them to do what a lot of people thought would happen as soon as America was born. The North and the South would divide. However, and I won't go into great detail about this because I want to stay focused on Lincoln, but it is Lincoln who says to keep Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And what that does is, of course, which, by the way, it doesn't kill anyone except for the celebration afterwards. 100-gun salute to the American flag, which is allowed by the Confederates, by the rebels, to take it out. But at gun 50, it explodes and kills 2 Union soldiers. And so after that, they decide to stop it there. But then Lincoln calls for volunteers. For volunteers, 90 days to put down this rebellion. Won't take long. Well, then it turns out this war is extending and is extending and is extending. And like I said earlier, Robert E. Lee has so much to do with extending the war by declining what Lincoln offered him and joining the Confederacy. And so after the Battle of Antietam, bloodiest one day in American military history, Lincoln is going to launch what he had been promising this, but he was told, you got to wait for a victory from the Union, for the Union. So you're not just pleading for help. So he had to wait, and he said, well, Antietam is not quite the battle I thought it should be, but here it is, the Emancipation Proclamation, September of 1862. I think it was out September 22nd. And basically what he says here is, hey, Confederate government states, you can totally come back into the Union. And if so, if you do it, you've got till January 1st, 1863, you come back in slavery intact, totally fine. But if not, he says he will issue On January 1st, 1863, he will issue another Emancipation Proclamation. And at that point, if you're not back in the Union, you are still enemies of the Union. And as our soldiers go through your areas, slaves will be freed forever. One thing that's very interesting about this, I always ask my kids, so how many slaves were actually freed? Emancipation Proclamation Day. The basic number is 0. Because Abraham Lincoln does not have, he says, I don't have the power to free the slaves of Kentucky. And by the way, 4 slave states remain in the Union. That would be Delaware, Maryland, Missouri, and Kentucky. And so he says, I cannot free the slaves in that territory or even territories captured by the Union Army, because this is probably the biggest executive order, which are big time now, in American history. This is as the military man, commander-in-chief. He says, our army is going to go and release slaves who are a gigantic asset to the Confederacy. And by the way, he mentions in this January 1863, if they want to, those former slaves can be freed and become soldiers. And while many Americans were like, we didn't sign up to stop slavery, by this is going on and on, this will weaken the South, and a lot of these former slaves will join the Union Army. It becomes accepted. And Lincoln is seen as a hero by so many people, of course, here. But he knows it is going to take an amendment. And if you've ever seen the movie Lincoln, you can see the 13th Amendment. He understands. He is very much saying this has to get through. We can't stop slavery by an executive order. It has to be from an amendment. Also want to mention Abraham Lincoln and the Gettysburg Address. I'm fascinated by the Gettysburg Address. January, like I said, 1863, he has now said the Emancipation Proclamation is for real. And so Union armies are now freeing slaves in Confederate-held territory. The bloodiest battle, because it's 3 days, is Gettysburg. And this ends up being a horrific battle, but it's also Lee is forced back into Virginia. But probably it's fairly well known for a cemetery that is put there. It's going to appear in November, around Thanksgiving of 1863. And Abraham Lincoln is invited to say a few appropriate remarks. He's not the lead speaker of that day. And it's a very, I almost want to cry, but that morning, and by the way, Abraham Lincoln had not only seen deaths around him, and he went to visit hospitals. Like I think I told you, Arlington, Lee's house becomes a cemetery. But he had his son die just before this. When this whole ceremony of Gettysburg and the founding of the cemetery started, it was very cloudy. And during a prayer time, the light came out. The sun came out. And people who saw Abraham Lincoln, the preacher who said this prayer said, it's November, remember, he said, as these trees, they appear to be dead, but they're not. These trees are not actually dead. They will come back in the spring. And people who saw it saw Abraham Lincoln is crying during this. And Abraham Lincoln, by the way, Abraham Lincoln, there were 2 things he studied big time in the early 1860s. That is military strategy and the Bible. Abraham Lincoln became big time studying the Bible and God's role in all of this. Seeing that he ends up saying, the South and the North, we both are wrong in many ways in looking at God's vision here. Well, to fast forward to Easter of 1865, it's very interesting. Antietam in 1862 is the bloodiest one day. 1863, we have Gettysburg. It's a 3-day battle, but it's the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. Well, along comes Ulysses S. Grant to take on Lee in 1864, and that is the bloodiest campaign in Civil War history. That is where Arlington Cemetery is born. And as they finally take Richmond, as I said, Lee is surrendering, and Lee will surrender on Palm Sunday. It's probably maybe the best that Lincoln has ever felt in his entire life. it feels incredible just relief that this war is going to be over. He delivers his last speech, and to kind of show you how far he has gone from the Lincoln-Douglas debate, saying, look, I don't think blacks should vote or serve in jury. He's just trying to stop the expansion of slavery. He says on Tuesday of Easter, the Easter week, Tuesday after Lee surrendered on Palm Sunday, he steps out and says that the black men who served in the Union Army and those who have been educated, you know what? They should get the vote. They should actually get to vote. Well, there's a man listening out there with one of his friends, and he says that's the last, he says a dirty word, I won't say it, but that's the last speech that he'll ever give. And of course, that was a very famous man. People would have known him right away as John Wilkes Booth, who heard that. And so it's Good Friday. We get to Good Friday. Lincoln goes with his wife to go see incredible play, Our American Cousin. He gets there late. Everybody stops and they stand and they clap for him. And then they start watching the play. It had a lot of funny things. John Wilkes Booth knew this play very well, so he's going to wait for the loudest moment when there's the most people laughing, when he's going to slip into this area. And before I get to what y'all know is going to happen, there's I don't know if it's controversy, but what were Lincoln's last words? A lot of historians say they'll think nothing of it. Lincoln, actually, during the play, he reaches out and will hold hands with his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, also a Kentucky woman. And they actually had a couple with them, and she says, oh my goodness, what will they think of it? I mean, holding hands there before a young couple, that was just, oh my goodness. He says they'll think nothing of it. A lot of people say that's it. But from her, Alan Guelza from Gettysburg College, also Springfield, where his archives are, there's a lot about Lincoln there. There are a lot of people who think these were his last words. And if it wasn't his last words that night, it's probably on a carriage ride that he took with Mary Todd Lincoln that day. And that was that he wanted to visit Jerusalem. He wanted to visit the home of our Savior. And then, of course, you all know, the bullet is going to enter his brain. And I won't get into the assassination, but there is no doubt here, that was Good Friday. A lot of people started to see him as a Jesus figure. And people started to see this entire realm here of America is being reborn at Easter. Something our public schools at least need to put out there. That there is something that just shocked so many people. Of course, the anger and obviously Reconstruction and what all, that's another whole story there. But the fact that the Civil War ended so peacefully compared to other places on the planet where Civil Wars don't end. There's no doubt, yes, there was the KKK. There were terrible things that happened. But here's the thing. The fact is right now, if you're watching this and you're a Southerner and you married a Northerner, by that's me. I married a Northern woman. And if you're together and we can just talk about this, that is amazing of how the North and South were able to get back together and of the surrendered Appomattox and then, of course, Good Friday. Just summarize, of course, this whole idea of Easter and the idea of the rebirth of America with all of its problems that go on. As long as it's led by we, the people, then, of course, there are going to be problems. But the idea that somehow America got through the Civil War, reunited, and became, by the way, by 1900, the most gigantic country the world has ever seen. And I'll leave it here. When they get back together, 2 gigantic world wars are out there. And if America hadn't been there, especially for World War II, what would have happened? Would love to talk at some point about World War II. Thank you all for watching this. I deeply appreciate it.